Full Throttle is probably one of the most imposing roller coasters at Six Flags Magic Mountain because it's right at the front of the park and it's super tall and eye-catching with that white and black color scheme. It really stands out against the mountain and the other coasters in the park. Plus, the loop is just freakishly tall. It's absolutely huge, and it's almost the height is really impressive, but seeing how wide it is also really impressive. It takes up an incredible amount of room, like in the park skyline. It's just so huge. And obviously the double-sided track is really imposing. That's super cool to look at. This ride has a really nice entrance plaza that's basically a section of the park. Sometimes Six Flags will have a band playing music right in front of the ride, so that's pretty cool. And the queue is all outdoors and mostly a cattle pen, and that cattle pen is right in front of a giant screen that's playing a bunch of sporty stuff, live life full throttle type of vibe. But this queue doesn't really offer that much protection from the Magic Mountain sun, so if you are really hot, I don't recommend getting in line for Full Throttle, especially because this attraction is pretty low capacity. I've seen this park run one train on this ride on pretty busy days, so this line can be absolutely brutal sometimes, which is why I try to hit this ride early. But that's always a difficult decision because Magic Mountain's ops are absolutely terrible right now, so there are plenty of rides that you might want to hit early. Full Throttle's station is also like half shaded. Fortunately though, the side where you wait to board the train is shaded, so that's pretty nice. But the exit ramp is out in the sun, and there's a good chance that if when you're waiting to launch on this ride, you'll be sitting in the sun, so just be warned. It's not the smartest design. Speaking of the trains on Full Throttle, they aren't the greatest. It's been pretty well documented that the Premier Rides trains are kind of problematic. They suck. Getting in and out of them is absolutely terrible. I mean, Full Throttles are easier than West Coast Racers because you don't have to deal with the comfort collar, but it's still really, really annoying. It kind of feels like they're kiddie coaster trains, like in terms of getting in and out, like especially if you have to cross to place loose articles into the bins and then getting back in. It's like so annoying. I can't tell you how many times I've like scraped my leg on the train or like rubbed it, so it's like really uncomfortable. It's just so annoying and so unnecessary. But when you're actually in the seat, it's fine. It's not that big of a problem. The seatbelts are standard, and the lap bars are actually pretty comfortable. They do have a shin guard, but it's kind of forgiving. I really don't like shin guards. They feel kind of pointless to me, and it's just annoying more than anything, but these are tolerable. Like when you're sitting in the station, it's kind of like, why is this here? But when you're actually experiencing the roller coaster, it's not that big of a deal. You definitely forget about it. I'm not going to be upside down on this humongous loop complaining about the shin guard. Speaking of the ride experience, it'll start off with a launch. From my experience on this attraction, the ride operator who's on the mic will actually have fun with the guests, either giving you a false countdown or making a little joke. That's always super fun, and I kind of wish Magic Mountain had more of that, so that fun energy for this crew is pretty good. They're also relatively efficient, which is nice because, as I mentioned, this ride is super, super low capacity. As for the launch itself, the pop, the initial start off is really fun. It's super sudden and pretty quick, but once you get going, it's not the fastest acceleration. You kind of just coast up to speed. It's not very forceful other than that first pop. The launch is pretty forgettable, but the loop following the launch is insane. This is probably my favorite inversion in all of Magic Mountain, which says a lot because this park has so many inversions. They have way too many inversions at Magic Mountain, and this one is probably my favorite. You get some insane hang time. It's like ridiculous. You have a crazy upside down view of the park. It's just mind-blowing. I remember thinking that the hang time was a little better in the back row than the front row, but it wasn't that big of a difference. The trains on this ride are pretty short, so for the most part the differences in forces will be pretty minimal, but I do prefer being on the ends of the train as compared to the middle because the forces will be more extreme. So yeah, it feels like you're upside down forever on that loop. It's pretty freaky how long you're upside down on the vertical loop because you can truly feel that the lap bar is holding your life. And that's just such a incredible feeling. It is freaky. It's totally scary, especially if you're not expecting hang time or if you don't ride a lot of roller coasters. But this is totally one of the greatest hang time moments I've ever been on. It's just absolutely spectacular. And then eventually you'll come back down and you pick up some crazy speed. You go from crawling and then you're flying down at the bottom. It's crazy how tall that loop is. It's just, there really isn't anything like it, because on other rides with massive loops, it's usually dwarfed by a lift hill, but this one just sends you straight into this massive structure. This circular structure. That's basically a majority of this ride's layout. Like, if you took away the loop and the top hat, this ride basically has no layout, which is I think that's the biggest flaw of this ride, because as we'll discuss, the following elements aren't exactly the greatest. At the bottom of the loop, you do get a little bit of positive Gs. They're pretty solid. They can be a little inconsistent. Like, sometimes I felt like this section of track that just climbs the mountain is pretty pointless and boring and almost wasted. But on a couple of my rides, I felt like you get some good positive Gs, especially on that first right turn. I did gray out a couple times, but you just kind of coast up the mountain pretty quickly, and then before you know it, you're at the top, and then you dive back down. One thing I do have to note, though, is that the rattle is it's the most noticeable at this section. I would say Full Throttle is a really smooth coaster, but this is where you might encounter a slight rattle, especially towards the back of the train, which is how it is on like every roller coaster. So just be aware. It's not painful or anything, it's just there. As for this dive loop, it's profiled really weird, because most dive loops you start from the ground and then you curve up and then you dive back down. But this one, you're already at the top, so you kind of just twist and then dive. So it might not be considered a dive loop, but that's kind of what it feels like. Like, you get hang time and then you accelerate before you hit the brakes immediately. But yeah, that hang time diving down is super fun in every row. Slamming to a stop at this point in the ride is kind of like, it's okay. I mean, on paper, it's a really major con, but in practice, you're kind of just processing what just happened, because you had two insane hang time moments. The first one being better than the second. And then you're not stopped for that long. Like, for example, Time Traveler at Silver Dollar City, you were stopped for a lot longer, it feels like. Like, this one, you kind of pause for a second and then listen to a little audio piece, and then you get rolling again. So it's not the worst thing in the world. And then the backwards launch, it's not that forceful, but being thrown into your lap bar instead of back against the seat, that's a really cool feeling, because you have a lot less support, so the force feels more powerful, I suppose, even though it's much slower than the original launch. Backwards launches are super fun, and this one does feel a little punchy, so that's pretty cool. It might actually be my favorite launch on the ride, to be honest. And then this rollback up into the dive loop, on paper it seems kind of useless, but in practice it's pretty fun, honestly. In the back you get crazy hang time, because you're twisted up all the way up to the top of the element, to the point where you're like upside down again. So you stall out upside down and you get another moment of crazy hang time, probably the second best on the ride, first being the loop and then the worst being the original dive into this element. But as for the front row, I would say you get more float than hang time, because you're at the bottom of the element, but you're still like hanging onto the lap bar, so you're being pushed into it instead of up onto it. So it's still a really fun floaty feeling. And then after that stall out, you dive back down into the tunnel and then you're pushed through it really quickly. This launch doesn't feel that special, it just kind of happens and you're like, whoa. All right. After that, you curve back up into the same element that you were on, but this time you're going to be on the other side of it as you crest over the top hat. When you're in the front row, you get some awesome floater airtime cresting into it, but it will stop once you reach the peak, which is kind of lame. In the back, you get some light floater cresting into it, and then it disappears. And then when you're actually at the top, you just kind of coast over it. You do get a nice view, but you don't have much time to take it in, because afterwards you have an insane drop. In the front row, you get some nice floater right before you decelerate, so it's super comfortable. And the back is pretty much the exact opposite. You get absolutely thrown. It's super powerful, super awesome, but then the brakes violently shove you forward. It's super steep too. It's kind of frustrating. I know a lot of people don't mind the brakes, but for me it's just kind of like it's not the most comfortable sensation. It's like crazy. I've heard some people make the argument that the brakes make that drop even more insane because you're shoved up out of your seat when the drop begins as you experience the insane airtime, and then at the bottom of the drop, instead of just landing, you're shoved forward because you're decelerating as you're still floating. Which I understand that, and to a degree I kind of agree with it, but I feel like it would have been better if it was just a traditional drop. Like, even if you just still dropped into the brake run, being able to land and then decelerate would have been better. Like, if they really wanted to, I feel like they could have had that really steep drop and then have like a helix or something and then hit the brakes, so you can have one element to burn off that energy, because being that high off the ground and then ending the ride immediately is super lame. Like, I'm pretty sure that's the tallest point of the coaster. So you max out and then you end. And that's the end of it. Like, the drop is awesome, and it's definitely a highlight of the ride. I would say that the loop is peak Full Throttle, but the drop in the back row is also awesome. If this ride just had like one more element, I feel like it would have been a lot better. Or even on the contrary, if it committed to being a really short ride, it might have been better for people, because rides like Top Thrill Dragster and King Dakar, they're basically one element, and for the most part it feels like Full Throttle is also one element, but it's the double-sided track. So it's technically two elements, but it's the same structure. I kind of wonder what it would have been like if this ride was just like the vertical loop, and then you go into a traditional dive loop, and then maybe hit a booster that sends you up into the top hat, and then the ride just ends. I don't know, just the sequence of events on this ride, it feels like this coaster is almost out of order, which is super bizarre. The elements that feel the most lackluster are in the middle, and that's just so weird, because it starts with a bang and it ends with a bang, and the middle is just kind of forgettable, honestly. Like, I think the hang time on the stall out is super fun, but you have to like actively pay attention to remember that, because you're going to be walking off talking about the loop and talking about the drop. So this is just such a bizarre coaster. I still feel like it's in the elite tier at Magic Mountain. This is a total tangent, but I feel like most parks have like a top 3, a top 2, or even a top 5. But in my opinion, I think that Magic Mountain has a top 6, a big 6, and I would put Full Throttle in that top 6. So it's definitely upper tier at Magic Mountain, in my opinion. Because yes, this coaster is flawed, but it's just so much fun, and it kind of feels like the flaws it has are nitpicks. So I don't know. This is just such an interesting ride. Maybe if it had like a speed hill at some point in there, I feel like it might be a more complete ride experience. Like if it had a pop up instead of those twists up the mountain, because you just kind of fly up there and then it's basically over. I feel like if you had that high intensity turn, maybe tightened it up a little bit so you get more positives, and then had an airtime pop and then you hit that dive loop, I feel like that might have been better. It made the ride feel more complete. As it stands today, I feel like it's basically a one element ride in the same way that Top Thrill Dragster is, or even Accelerator at Knott's. But that one element is just so good that it kind of carries the ride. And you can't really complain about length on this ride, because it's definitely on the shorter side, but when I hit the brake run, I still feel like it's a complete ride experience, because that backwards launch just extends the ride time so much. Even if most of that time is when you stop and then reverse, it still feels like ride time, because at least Six Flags played that audio. That's like one of the most consistent effects at Magic Mountain. Like, for example, the fire on X2, I've literally never seen it working, which is absolutely hilarious. But the audio, on the other hand, in Full Throttle, I've never seen it not working, so that's good. And I gotta give credit to Magic Mountain for that. So it might sound I'm leaning a little negative on this ride, but I truly think this ride is awesome. As I said, it's in the top 6 at Magic Mountain. It's not even the worst in the top 6 in my opinion. It's an awesome ride experience, and I would love to marathon this ride, but the capacity is just is really preventing me from doing that, so that's a big shame. Maybe one day. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Full Throttle at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you later.